Hello, everybody. It's Kevin Bales here. I'm coming from my home on the island of Guernsey, which is off the coast of the United Kingdom. I'm very excited and rather honored to be opening up the University of Nebraska at Lincoln Human Trafficking and Migration Virtual Summit, the special get-together that we're going to do online with such an amazing list of speakers over the month of October. I want to thank especially those Sriani Tidball and Brianna Gerritsen, who have done such a brilliant job in putting everything together for the rest of us. And I hope it's as seamless as it seems to have been so far, and I hope that we're all able to communicate offline as well and ask each other questions. I certainly welcome questions about anything that I have to say in this talk. Meanwhile, the talk I'd like to give is about new ideas, new tech, new approaches to combating modern slavery and human trafficking. At the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham, we're doing a lot of interesting work in a whole series of different areas, but all of them focusing on bringing slavery to an end in one way or another. I've also got a lot of new resources that I can share. We are launching a number of websites that carry data or instructions or legal support. All of those things will be in the talk as well. I want to talk today a little bit about the recent breakthroughs that we believe we've been having at the University of Nottingham in the Rights Lab, some technological, some to do with ideas and approaches, but also to offer some what I think will be very useful resources for everyone. I'll start by talking a little bit about slavery groups, pro-slavery groups that exist out there, not anti-slavery groups, but pro-slavery groups like ISIS, and how they are practicing slavery in conflict and war. Notice that this is an issue of ISIS online English magazine, Dabiq. Don't go looking it up yourself. If you do online, you may get flagged by an intelligence agency in whichever country you happen to be living in. But notice this article about how and why ISIS fighters should be allowed, in fact, encouraged and morally right to carry out slavery within the jihad that they were fighting in northern Iraq just a couple of years ago. Now, we've looked at this very carefully and much more closely. And this map, for example, is how some of that played out. There was a tremendous invasion of the area of northern Iraq where the Yazidi people were living. The Yazidis are not Muslim, they're not Christian, they're not Jewish, they're a group all unto themselves. And for one key reason to do with theology, they were considered to be enslavable by ISIS according to their theological doctrines. They launched a surrounding and encircling attack on the whole Yazidi area. They took a very large number of people into captivity. They killed a very large number of people as well. And you can see from this map where they had a system of slavery in conflict, where they registered people, took them to slave markets and sold them on. There are also areas where they eliminated them, mass murders. But then for some enslaved male children, there were training centers. Now, this was all fairly well documented, but what we did was take a next step and say, how in fact is the framework, is the system working? And on this slide, you can see how that does happen. How at the very beginning of the conflict, the ISIS took the Yazidi people, divided them in by gender and by age, and cut them into these groups in order to best exploit them. Women and girls in particular, you will see, were transported across other districts and into other countries. They were divided up into how they thought they might be used. Some were sold as slaves in market. Some were sold on the internet into other countries. Some were married, and you have to use inverted commas there, quotation marks, because they were handed over to soldiers to use as really forced sex, but with the idea of procreation, of making babies that could then be raised as new ISIS fighters. In a sense, the rape of these forced marriages inoculated them against genocide because they were then considered to be part of a Muslim family. Some were used in what were basically brothels, and so forth. Men were executed. Some were put into forced labor. Children and boys were forced into slavery, into military uses. They became child soldiers. And the entire system operated well and very efficiently. It was almost like the way the Nazis had organized the concentration camp systems, in that there were very clear flow charts of how slavery would be carried out and justified during this conflict. One of the things that we are able to share with you now is a website that logs slavery in conflicts, not just for ISIS in northern Iraq, but in fact for 171 conflicts. In other words, all the conflicts that have occurred in the world between 1989 and 2016 are recorded in this database. They're coded according to years. In other words, some conflicts only last a few months, but some last for decades. So you code conflicts in this way by conflict year, in which it's kind of shocking to think that between 1989 and 2016, there were 1,113 conflict years. Now here's the shocker in many ways. Up to 90% of those 1,113 conflict years record some form of slavery: child soldiering, forced marriage, use as laborers, and so forth. We're excited that you'll be able to reach out to this database, which records all those different types of slavery, as well as whether they were tactical forms of slavery or strategic forms of slavery, and use these data freely. It's a wide open database. It can be downloaded. You can add in your own variables. You can build from that, and we're hoping that other people will use it to explore this whole large but relatively unknown area of slavery within modern forms of conflict. I want to talk about as well machine learning, a whole series of things that we've been doing in the lab that we see as a real breakthrough. I call it machine learning and the epidemiology of modern slavery. I call it that in part because we've had lots of discussions in the lab about how epidemiology as a field has a lot to offer the study of modern slavery, that we need to work at many of the same levels, ground level, but also national level, global, looking at causes and effects and so forth. Here's a little harken back to the past, where you can see John Snow's cholera map of London in 1854 on one side, and a map that we've generated using machine learning of Dar es Salaam, the capital of Tanzania, and the levels of forced labor in Dar es Salaam at that time. Now, this is a very interesting and fairly complex part of the work, is how do we get there? How do we build these maps that are put together? Because it's not just about going on the ground and asking some questions. In Tanzania, we've been able to gain access to basically the telephone system. We can't record everybody's identities or anything like that, but we are able to follow messages and calls and data and money transfers, which is very important in Africa, as well as using Earth observation imagery from satellites. We load those types of information into relational databases. We use ground truthing data. We use proxy data that comes through the telephone links. And then we let the machines build and rebuild the algorithms that are modeling the realities of forced labor, but also modeling the spaces in which we might be able to intervene. For example, here's that same map a little closer, but now with the proxies. We now understand which are those variables that we can measure on ground, but also through official records and sometimes even through the satellite imagery or telephone records. What are the predictors, the intense predictors of forced labor in the very large city and very disorganized city, which is Dar es Salaam? We use ground truthing, of course, and we bring people into the field there, and we ask a lot of people a lot of questions on the ground, but we don't have to do that at the scale that you might expect because of the ways that machine learning has now been built into generating the pointers of where we might go to look for the sorts of slavery that we're concerned about. And when we can do it at a level in Tanzania, we can probably go toward the whole planet. Now, this is grandiose, and I've highlighted down there James Goulding, who directs this side of our research. He's a grandiose thinker, I'd say. But the idea is that he said, here's a way we could begin to build the receipt, analysis, the engineering, deriving the features, building up more and more data about slavery in different locations around the planet, building our proxy measures across different locations across the planet, and then be able to make comparisons between all of the different areas where we could be gathering these data, but in the same variables, in the same predictors, and use that to make the comparisons that we need to understand how best to build the policies. It's a worldwide observatory. We're not there yet. We're on the way there. I think we may also be asking who's going to pay for such a large piece of work, but at least we know it's possible. And it's the sort of, in a sense, what's happening right now around the world with COVID, in that there are a large number of epidemiological research areas and groups working together. Are they building a worldwide observatory? I don't know, but they should be, because like slavery, COVID's covering the whole planet. I want to go to another zone of breakthrough. Slavery is illegal everywhere. I've said that 1,000 times in my career. I've believed that that was true. And in fact, one of my colleagues has told me that's just not true. So slavery is illegal everywhere? Nope, it's not. And I'm amazed, but also powerfully influenced by what we've discovered in this way. We now know, because of deep, deep research into all the laws of all the world, that the criminal law prohibiting slavery and the slave trade is only illegal in just over half of the world's countries. So in fact, the picture that you're looking at now, the bright red colors are the countries that have laws against slavery and the slave trade. But the sort of purpley colors are the ones that don't. Now, they may have some other kind of law, they may have some other sort of angle that they're putting on it, but 49%, 94 countries appear not to have any criminal legislation prohibiting slavery. Now, how did we get to this? And how did we miss this for so long? Well, in part, it's because virtually every country has some kind of law about some part of slavery or trafficking or forced labor or servitude or practices similar to slavery, such as forced marriage and child marriage. So that out of the 194 United Nations member states or countries, something like 58% don't have forced labor laws, 93% don't have servitude laws against that criminalize servitude, 170, 88% countries don't criminalize the four institutions and practices similar to slavery. This all came about by a big, deep dive into the world's laws. But it's led to this. Another website, antislaverylaw.ac.uk, open to you, ready to go, giving all the laws for all the countries in all different parts of the legal understanding of slavery, trafficking, forced labor, and so forth. You can filter, you can build the maps, you can look at the actual legislation as well. You can then call up on summaries of findings and international instruments and so forth. It's an exciting, very exciting piece of work, because while in my 20 years in this field, people have been talking about getting the laws in order and trying to get laws passed, now we actually know precisely where the holes are and how to plug them. So that I can look at my colleague here. This is Katarina Schwartz, who put this work together. And she said recently that look, we've compiled all these laws. We have more than 4,000 individual provisions within these 193 laws, and we know whether every state has carried out its international commitments or not. Now, that's one thing, to be able to say to a country, you can do better. But I think what's especially exciting about this is that we're going to be able, through Katerina's work, to build bespoke, custom model legislation for each country, because we know precisely the provisions and laws that need to be repaired in those countries. The great goal here is a worldwide, if not unanimity or perfection in agreement, at least a sufficient coverage of law to be brought against slavery, trafficking, all the other parts of slavery violation. Another zone, corpus linguistics. Now, corpus linguistics is about using very large computer files of text and to analyze that text using algorithms that look at the patterns, in a sense, the thinking behind that text. Let me give you an example. This is a tiny little word cloud that I made myself using about 30 pages of recent slave narratives. And of course, a word cloud only tells you what are the key concepts or the key words that occur most often in that 30 pages of narrative text. It's interesting to me that thought is the most prevalent word. Move, want, different, and God. Those are the key words that were coming through those narratives. Well, corpus linguistics is a little like a supercharged word cloud. Big data analytics takes over 1 million words of slave narratives and says, what can we learn by the linguistic structures that underpin all of these slave narratives? Well, for one thing, when we look into the hundreds of minds of survivors of slavery, we find, for example, that survivors rarely use the future tense or talk in any way about the future. And if they do so, if they do touch on the future, this is immediately followed by a sudden past tense. This tells us a lot and backs up some other findings that we've been having about our understanding that people who are caught up in slavery are also caught up in what we call atemporality and aspatiality. Now, those are slightly ambiguous sounding words, but what they simply mean is this. A person in slavery is caught in an eternal and pretty grim present. In other words, they have very little to no future and very little to no past. Why? Because they learn early on in slavery that if they think or talk about the future, they'll be harmed. If they think and talk about the past, if they focus in that direction, they'll be hurt. And the result is that they, through pain, learn quickly to stick in the present and to pay attention to the slaveholder and what they want and insist upon. The same applies to the space that they live in, that they learn that if they try to move around, get away, up and down, back and forth, it's going to be painful if they do not obey the spatial as well as the temporal insistence on sticking in one place and not thinking about the future or the past or where you might want to go. That's the lived experience of slavery. That was a big eye-opener for me. I know that all of us who have been born and lived in freedom all our lives find it hard to truly comprehend the nature of enslavement. I think we're getting a little closer with ideas like this. Would you like to look into the same sorts of things? Well, another resource, another website on antislavery.ac.uk. AC is academic community. It's like the EDU in the United States. But antislavery.ac.uk is our anti-slavery usable past website. It has a whole series of subsets. One is narratives. We have 1,151 modern, contemporary slave narratives logged in, over 1 million words that can be used to explore, analyze, think about, illustrate, and so forth. There's also an amazing collection of anti-slavery murals that have been brought together, work from the Congo, things from the past, as well as the current, and a lot of tips and materials for teaching about slavery on our antislavery.ac.uk website from the Anti-Slavery Usable Past Project. One more. How do we see slavery from space? Well, this started some time ago. In many ways with this shot from space that I found originally on Google Earth. I had been in the Sundarbans UNESCO World Heritage Site off Bangladesh. I had found child slavery there, pretty horrific child slavery. So it's like a absolutely preserved and protected forest. And yet, look, you can see the forest on the right, but on the left, something else is going on. It looks a bit like buildings, but it's not. It's actually fish drying racks. And those children have been lured or kidnapped from upriver in Bangladesh, brought here and work sometimes more than over 24 hours in a day. I mean, they'll be forced to work all the way straight through. They're treated horribly. They're sexually assaulted. They're battered and bruised. They're starved. The most serious illness or health risk that they had when I was able to interview a number of them who had just been liberated was, they said, diarrhea, that everyone had diarrhea, and every child I spoke to knew someone who had died of what they called diarrhea while being enslaved in the camp. The other shocker for me was that when I said, what else was the problem? Every child that I interviewed told me that they had either witnessed or knew a child who had been eaten by a tiger. Now, I know that sounds shocking and strange, but the fact is that the UNESCO Sundarbans World Heritage Site is a preservation. It's one of the few places where Bengal tigers run wild and are free. It's supposed to be a forest that's never touched, like the Yellowstone Park in the United States or parts of the Amazon, which are so precious. But the criminals who care about using small children and are interested in brutalizing them for a profit don't care about the environment. They don't care about the endangered species of the tigers. And they certainly don't care if the endangered tigers pushed into smaller territories then take up a new prey animal who is simply a child. How did we begin to look at this more closely? Well, this is a photo of one of the slave drivers taken by a very brave Bangladeshi photographer that I know, who was beating children to make them work faster on the fishing racks. We began to look closely at the satellite record. I was able to work with our geospatial team and go back in time, because satellite imagery now goes back almost 30 years, and say, what was the pattern? Where are the patterns of this kind of exploitation against both human beings and the environment? The remarkable thing was that not only could we easily find the camps that I knew where they were, we began to find more camps across the past, camps where we could look and see where they had been. And we were able to point to 5 new camps that I don't think anyone knew about except the criminals, that we could report into the Bangladeshi government, who are sort of beginning to maybe thinking about do something about it. Sadly, it's a corrupt government. The second part of the satellite work that I want to point to is to do with machine learning and crowdsourcing. We were beginning to wonder as well about the level of slavery in brick kilns across South Asia, Pakistan, Nepal, India, and so forth. And to say, we know there's a lot of slavery in brick kilns. Everyone has seen the pictures of that. But how many kilns are there? Turns out no one knew. And also, we need to know where they are and are they operating or not. We began to use crowdsourcing to look at the maps, at the satellite images of brick kilns around South Asia. It was something that students did, and volunteers from all over the world helped us to look, and it sort of looked like this. You'd be shown a bit of satellite imagery, and you'd be shown how to pick out what looked like a brick kiln and then how to mark that so that the computer that was recording everything could record precisely the locations. But what the participants didn't necessarily know was that behind that recording, and the computer was learning. It was machine learning brought to bear so that it would say when there's a high enough level of agreement among the humans that that is definitely a brick kiln, then I'm learning more and more about the features that I should look for. I'm talking like a computer now, to make the decisions about what also is a brick kiln without any human telling me what it is. It took some weeks, months, for the machine learning to take place and the algorithms within the computer to come to a sense of certainty about, or at least a high enough level of certainty about how it could record how many, if a site was in fact a brick kiln. Once that happened, the computers, the machines that had learned, were able to work very quickly and to find all of the brick kilns, not just the recent ones, but they could find the old ones, the ones that were being built, the ones that were operating, the ones that weren't operating, and ultimately some 54,000 brick kilns were identified. Here are all the kilns that we believe are in the brick belt. As you can see, that's Pakistan up on one end, Nepal, India, all the way over into Bangladesh, almost into China, a few of them. We now know how many, and we now know where. Now, of course, the question becomes, how do we get to them? But that's also part of the process. We're able to say, where are our new kilns being built? Where are old kilns being abandoned? Where are the places we should be pointing our work and helping governments to address this? Another area, a breakthrough about deforestation. One of the things that I spent a lot of time on in my book, Blood and Earth, was the level of deforestation that occurs at the hands of enslaved workers. It was remarkable to me that in fact, such a significant part of deforestation was occurring by slave labor, and then calculating up to determine how much CO2 was being pushed into the air, how much climate change was being affected by the fundamentals of deforestation at the hands of slaves. Now, one of the areas that we then went to was to also bring in satellite imaging after the book was published. And we began to get two parts of information: a measurement of the level of deforestation and the industries that have an impact on deforestation, as well as the levels of modern slavery for those countries. So we began to make the correlations between how many people were in fact enslaved in this space and what was the environmental impact as well as the human rights impact. Here are some of the key countries that we looked at so carefully: Brazil, Ghana, Mozambique, all of Indonesia, all of these areas with extensive rainforests, crucial forests, all of these areas showing high levels of deforestation. And also in a few places, like the top of Brazil or the right side of Indonesia, the forests that we really should be protecting. And we have to think through how to make that work, not least because if slavery at 40 million people in the world were a country or a US state, if slavery of 40 million people were a US state, for example, and had the GDP that the United Nations says slavery has, about 150 billion US dollars per year in the turnover of slavery. So we'd be talking about fairly small and fairly poor states or countries. So if slavery were a country, it'd be about the size of Algeria. It would be about the size of the population of California. It would be about the gross domestic product, the GDP of Bulgaria, which is not a rich country at all, or Kansas, which I appreciate, especially if you're sitting in Nebraska today and you're looking over your shoulder or down, as you do on Kansas. You think, how on earth does Kansas manage to have a GDP of $150 billion? I don't understand what they're doing in Kansas, but something's going on there. That's not the important thing. The important thing is it would be a small, poor country. 40 million people in slavery would be a small, poor country if it were a country, but it would also be the country that has the third largest amount of CO2 emissions in the world after China and the United States. There is no other country that has up to 2.5 billion tons of CO2 emission. The European Union has a little bit more of that all put together in other groups of states. But as treated as an individual country, slavery is the third largest emitter of CO2 in the world. Now we have to think about how CO2 emissions cause enormous climatic problems, which lead to dramatic weathers and natural disasters, which lead to forced migration and people fleeing terrible situations like hurricanes and cyclones, and then how that increases the vulnerability of enslavement, which leads to people being enslaved, often in things that do deforestation. And you begin to understand the vicious cycle of how slavery and environmental destruction work to reinforce and increase each other. Now, where are we going next? Well, coming soon. Slavery on Mars? Slavery on Mars? You think we may have gone over the top here. But here's the interesting thing that one of our colleagues has begun to introduce to us in terms of slavery on Mars. It may already be there. Now, here's one of the rovers that NASA has put up on Mars. It's driving around up there, it's taking pictures. It's kind of a welcome wagon for if astronauts ever get there. But here's the thing, what's it made of? Well, it's made of the same kind of electronics that you have in your laptops and your phones, that in the laptop that I'm staring at right now. And we know that there's slavery in those electronics. We know there's cadmium and titaniums, a whole series of molybdenums and other, especially cassitarites, which go into electronics and the types of materials that you might need to build a Mars rover, which have come from the hands of slave labor. Slave labor in the Congo, slave labor in East Africa as well, and parts of the Far East, even in those areas where they occasionally dig in places like Australia. Now, we don't want, and my colleague Juliana Simeoni doesn't want, for us to be able to start exporting slavery onto other planets. It's bad enough that we have it ourselves. So she says, in our lifetime, humanity will go deeper into space than ever before. But history's clear that some of humanity's greatest advances have paradoxically come at the expense of humanity itself. And boy, ain't that the truth when you think about the European invasion of North and South America and the genocide and the terror that came from that. And she says, we should think about slavery-free Mars, not because we're worried necessarily that suddenly slavery is going to break out on Mars, but it's right at that point between technologies and space science and the law and the social sciences and the businesses that supply materials and electronics to NASA. And it makes sense that if we can begin to figure out how to eliminate the possibility of slavery on Mars, we'll discover that we may have the tools to eliminate it here on Earth, or as she says, the only home most of us will ever know. It's a concept, it's an idea, and it's a challenge. And it's one of those ones that I have to say, it sounds out there, way out there, all the way out into the Martian orbit out there, but it's worth using as a touchstone or an example to help lead us into a new space of thinking about slavery in our lives. I also want to point to the fact that, as we all know, slavery brings trauma. And this is another one of our coming soon zones. Here are some children being led off. One of the children, age 13, drew this after he'd been brought out of being a child soldier, but had been being led off after the destruction of his home and his village, and into probably being a child soldier and possibly being sexually assaulted as well by some rebel troops. Here's what we don't know enough about, and that is, how does that affect the brain? How does the trauma of slavery affect the brain immediately in terms of brain trauma, and over long term in terms of epigenetic impacts? Now, we're lucky that we work at the University of Nottingham, because that's where MRI was invented quite a long time ago, a few decades back, and the chap who did it got a Nobel Prize for it. We want to use brain imaging to look at the brains of people who have been in slavery. That's been done for lots of athletes. A lot of soldiers have had brain imaging to understand the trauma of combat. A lot of football players are having, American football players are having brain imaging to see about that kind of damage. It's been done with Holocaust survivors and Romanian orphans, but we really need to understand better. If there are 40 million people in the world in slavery, we need to be able to understand the specific biological impacts on the brain of the trauma of enslavement. We want to do that next. It's one of the things that we're trying to get teed up and funded. Finally, just to say thank you. We've been very fortunate in building up our program over the last few years. A lot of it's because the University of Nottingham decided to take a chance. They said, well, we're world #1 in things like MRI, brain imaging. What could we do that we could also become world #1? And we convinced them to take a chance, that if we brought enough people and programs together, we could make some real breakthroughs in addressing slavery around the world. We now have 5 large research programs, 77 researchers in the lab, but it's all pointing to one thing: how we bring an end to slavery. And as you can see, yet another website if you want to have a look at what the Rights Lab, or you can just Google Rights Lab Nottingham. It's been a great pleasure to share these ideas with you today. I've had such a good time thinking about them, putting the pictures together. I just wish that we could all be there together, talking together, asking questions, having a cup of tea or coffee together, and like that. But we'll do that. This epidemic won't last forever. And in the meantime, I know we're all going to keep doing what we do, which is working our best to bring an end to human trafficking and slavery around the world. Thank you very much.